Well, it's awesome to be with you guys this morning. It's a real privilege to have church leadership teams here together, to have a common experience, learn some things, work on yourselves, kind of on your inside lives, work on your church. I am so glad that each of you committed the time to come as teams. That makes this experience a little different than any other experience we do at the association. It's a team where it's a conference or an experience where we want teams to roll their sleeves up and do some hard inner work on yourself and on your church. And I just want to, first of all, just welcome you. Thank you for coming. But I also want to share with you a little bit of what's at stake in the work that you're going to be doing here in the next few days. A lot's at stake. And it speaks to the very core of why the WCA exists as a ministry. I remember about 20 years ago, I'm celebrating my 20th anniversary here at the association. And I remember a long time ago, thank you so much. It's great. But I remember a long time ago when my kids were much younger, maybe 10 years old or something like that. And I was coming out, we were visiting a church. She was with me. We got out of the church and she looks at me quite puzzled and she says, "Dad, what is it that you do again? What's your job?" Because people would ask her and she didn't know what to say. Well, I didn't work on a church staff, but she didn't know what to say. And I thought, oh man, how do I explain this to a 10-year-old? And then some words just came to my mind. And so, well, Esther, I think God's called me to a ministry that helps churches do church better. And she said, oh, okay, cool. And that was it. And then I thought of those words, we exist to help churches do church better. And I remember early on, I guess when we started in 92, late 20s, about 30, and Bill asked me to lead this ministry, and no kidding, I felt so inadequate. I'd never led anything before. I felt like I didn't know what to do. I didn't think I had what it took to lead this ministry. There were 6 of us on staff. Staff meeting was around a table like that. And I remember praying the Experiencing God prayer. You guys know that? Experiencing God deal? Don't make your plans and ask God to bless them. Ask God to open your eyes to the things He's doing around you because He's always at work. And you join Him. You just join Him. Wherever God is working around you, join Him. So I began to pray that prayer and say, God, what are you doing through this ministry to churches called the association? There were some people that were saying, oh, it's going to be a denomination. Felt no energy in that. 70% of our churches were already in denominations. Thought that was interesting. Not indicating any interest to leave. So what are we? What is this thing to be? And so I kept praying that and praying that. I kept asking people. I kept observing you. I kept observing your churches. What was going on? What was the unique contribution we were making? And as I began to study what was going on in you, this theme of change kept popping up. People would say, it came to an experience, they would say, I'll never be the same. I'll never view church work the same. So this theme of change started to emerge. And so I immersed myself in trying to understand change. How does that happen? And then I ran into a guy named Ev Rogers, the late Ev Rogers. He passed away in 2005. And many people regard this guy as kind of the father of understanding how it is that new ideas become normal. How do new ideas become normal in a church, in a society, in an organization, in any kind of a system? How do new ideas become normal? So I said, well, I got to go meet this guy. Wrote this big, thick book, executive summary of 4,000 change initiatives that he studied over time. And he was the first guy that drew this little graph that you probably have all seen, but you probably don't know. Let me use the black one here. You probably don't know where it came from. You've seen this graph. 2% innovators, 14% early adopters, early majority, late majority, laggers. Anybody ever seen this innovation curve? Yeah. Probably almost every marketing strategy that exists in the world is based off some of the thinking that Ev Rogers did more than half a century ago. Studied the farm revolution. It was the first one that he studied. How was it that happened? And so he was the first one that categorized people in terms of their acceptance and embracing of innovativeness, of change, their willingness to adopt new things. And then he went on to tell me the characteristics of these two first groups right here, the innovators and early adopters. And as he started to tell me that, and as I started to reflect back to him the kind of churches that were coming to us, that God was calling us to serve, he began to say, you know what, Jimmy? You've been given the gift to serve the pioneers. Most companies around the world, they spend lots of money trying to find the pioneers because they know if they can serve them, it unlocks the majority. So they spend all sorts of money. They give shoes free to Michael Jordan. They try to get Notre Dame to wear their stuff. And these are the influencers, pioneers, first responders, most willing to embrace change. And as I started to look at the churches in the association that were coming to us, they reflected this. And here's why. One of the key characteristics of that group of DNA'd people is that they're voracious learners. Voracious learners. And in the early days of the association, all we were doing was telling the story of one church, Willow Creek Community Church. That's all we were just telling that story. But innovators have an insatiable curiosity to what's new. If there's a new story in Southern California at Saddleback, they'll go there. If there's a new story at Willow Creek, they'll go there, or Life Church, or North Point. They'll fly to the other side of the world to go visit the Sumbukum Church there, the Full Gospel Church in South Korea, the world's largest church. They'll go wherever they need to go because innovators learn best from innovators. So you can't help it. So innovators, pioneers, first responders, you'll find yourself trying to find others. Because here's the other thing that I know about pioneers and first responders is that they're a minority in the world. So pioneering is lonely business. So because pioneering is lonely business, these pioneers go and find others because they need encouragement. And so in those early days when we were telling the story of one church, there's, by the way, denomination one, we were kind of attracting a certain kind of church leader from that denomination. But I remember in our first year, we only had 250 churches, and already we had over 50 denominations represented in the association. Today we have over 90 denominations represented in the association. Denomination 2, Denomination 3, Denomination 4, etc. But the key thing was what Ev Rogers said, says you've been given the gift of a ministry to the pioneers. And here's why it's critical that they prevail. It's critical that they prevail because if they don't, society will change. And the church won't change. Structures won't change. And so what's going to happen? Who do you think are the first churches to begin to get put to the side of the road and become irrelevant? It's kind of the laggard churches. Why? Because no one showed them the way. Now those churches disappear. Now we have this many churches. And if leadership doesn't come from this group, if this group does not prevail, again, culture will gobble up this next group of churches that just won't change enough to make it into the next generation. And then culture changes again. And then these last responder type churches don't change enough, and then they disappear if leadership doesn't happen. And then that process continues. That's what happened in Europe. The structures around the church were so, I want to say, oppressive to the pioneer. It took a revolution in the Reformation to create some change, but the structures around church kept things from moving, kept leadership from happening with the pioneers who needed to be supported, encouraged, and resourced so they could innovate new patterns, fresh biblical patterns of church life. And because that didn't happen, culture started putting churches aside. So the role of these people is critical. And I remember I got on the plane, went down to University of New Mexico at Albuquerque because Ev Rogers was a professor there. Bob Buford and I went together to learn from this man before he passed away, to just learn everything we could. And he said, here's the key. He asked me a question, and he said, how long do you think it takes for the average innovative thought in the education sector to reach the average elementary school on the street? 70% adoption. Let me say that again. How long do you think it takes the most innovative education method or strategy to reach the average elementary school on the street? That means you got about 70% adoption in the education sector. I said, well, I don't know. He said, how about a guess? Anybody? How long do you think it takes? 20 years. Not bad. 26 years. 26 years. That's if all things go well. Then he asked me, how far behind the times do you think the average church is to kind of the fresh move of God in church? And I just chuckled. I went, 50 years? A generation? I don't know. But we can't afford to do that. A lot of cultural and societal experts say that culture is morphing almost every 4 years and getting quicker. And if the church doesn't develop a muscle to know how to change, it won't change where it needs to change, and it'll be pushed to the side. And I don't know about you, but I don't want what happened in Europe to happen in the United States. So for that to happen, these pioneers must prevail. Because here's what I learned, and here's what I see reflected in reality of how life works, is that if pioneers prevail, if they succeed, if they are thriving and successful, they blaze new trails and patterns for who to follow. And so that's when it kind of came crashing into us to say, oh, Lord, that's what you're calling. By virtue of who you are bringing to us, you are giving us a ministry to these pioneers, to these first responders, across all these denominations. And we don't ever want to be a denomination. There's plenty of them. There's over 200 of them in this country. It's plenty. We don't need one more. But we need a ministry to resource these pioneers. And then I looked at church history, and good Baptist boy, I said, when did Sunday school get started? Did it start with Jesus? I mean, how long has Sunday school been around? Anybody know who started Sunday school? Or many believe who started Sunday school? Rakes. Hey, good answer. Robert Rakes from the United Kingdom. He was concerned about the youth of his day. They were working in factories. They weren't going to school. They were illiterate. Crime was high. He says, I know what I'll do. I'll do church on Sunday, and I'll teach the kids how to read and write. But not only that, I'll teach them about God. Then Sunday school came to the United States. And across all these denominations, you saw the Sunday school movement start, taking off in the 1800s. What was interesting about that is that you saw the spontaneous creation of a certain kind of ministry. Sunday school agencies, unions, and associations that were trans-denominational. You know what their purpose was? To resource the Sunday school pioneer, to network the Sunday school pioneer, to encourage the Sunday school pioneer, to network them. Why? So that they could prevail. What I also found interesting is that in that time, no kidding, this is how it was written in the book, there were preachers going around the country preaching on the evils of Sunday school. Think about that, on the evils of Sunday school. Why? Because they thought it was a bad idea to decentralize the preaching of God's word to Farmer Brown, who doesn't have an elementary school education barely. How is it that Farmer Brown's going to be able to teach the scriptures to another group of people and not have bad theology, bad application creep into the church? Decentralizing the teaching of God's word is a bad idea. Nonetheless, the Sunday school pioneer prevailed. By 1905, 85% of new converts were coming to Christ through the Sunday school movement. And today, we not only regard Sunday school as traditional, we regard it completely normal for church life. If you do church, of course you do Sunday school. It's kind of normal. It wasn't always normal. Well, friends, there are a lot of things that are normal in church life today that ought not to be, that need to change. There are human-made structures that keep the church from being the alive organism that it is. And it's the human parts that we put around it that we have a hard time adjusting. Without intentionality, they don't get adjusted. And they start to put an irrelevant cover around the always powerful and relevant message of Jesus Christ. And it keeps that message from reaching people. So we must do the hard work as church leadership teams to make the changes we need to make, to have the courage to go where it might be a little scary to go, all for the sake of Matthew 28. Helping reach the world for Christ, making disciples, reaching people far from God, and turning them into disciples of Christ, where they're reflecting his character over time. And here's what I also know to be true in observing the church the last 20, 30 years, is that enterprise functions with scale for almost 2,000 years always existed above the local church expression in denominational hierarchies and structures. That's changing in the last 20-some years. Significant enterprise kinds of scale are now inside the local church because our local churches, many of them are getting larger. Average church in the United States is 85 people. I venture to say almost every church here represented would be multiple times that. And with that kind of scale, Bill often says, when you grow, you lose something, you gain something. Well, sometimes when you get scale going on in your church, there's some things that you need to be real intentional about so that it never stops breathing and living like an organism should, like the church should be. And we turn it into structures instead of a Jesus movement that you're trying to cooperate with, because that's what we're trying to do in the church. A Jesus movement we're trying to cooperate with and collaborate with versus imposing our structures on it that shut it down. And so as we look for these next few days at some of those things in your setting, in your church, you're going to be taking a critical look at some things all around the process of bringing people to Jesus and reflecting his character over time. All around, how do we help that? How do we collaborate and cooperate with that? I just couldn't encourage you more to do the hard work. It will matter. It will be worth it. And I'm telling you, when your church prevails, it's not just your church that is going to be influenced and bring folks to Christ in your community. There are going to be other churches that are going to be looking to you. Understand your role, your pioneering role in our country. As you respond, as you move forward, you will blaze a trail for others to follow. And history shows that if you blaze a trail for these churches, they will sit up and take notice and follow your lead. But someone's got to blaze those first trails. That's what you guys are doing. And we've had a very simple strategy. All these years, it really hasn't changed. So we're all about helping the church thrive, and our strategy has been very simple. Lord, we see that when you can change a leader or a leadership core of the church, you can change that church. And when you can change that church, you can change the community. And not too long ago, I came across some statistics around how are things going, with church leaders in particular. And, I'm a very optimistic person. And I don't want to depress you by sharing these statistics, but I just want you to get a sense of what is at stake here. First with our churches and now with the leaders of our churches. This is from the Francis Schaeffer Institute of Church Leadership Development. They compiled these statistics from the Focus on the Family, Barna, and Fuller Seminary. They've all backed these findings. Every year now, 18,000 church leaders are leaving the ministry due to moral failure, spiritual burnout, or contention in their churches. 50% of church leaders' marriages will end in divorce. Same as the congregation, same as unchurched people. 80% of church leaders feel unqualified in their role as a church leader. 50% of church leaders are so discouraged they would leave the ministry if they could, but they have no other way of making a living. 80% of seminary and Bible school graduates who enter the ministry vocationally will leave the ministry within the first 5 years. That'd be like medical school graduates, 80% of medical school graduates not being in the medical profession 5 years after graduation. 70% of church leaders constantly fight depression. Almost 40% polled say they've had an extramarital affair almost since the beginning of their ministry. Almost 40% polled said they've had an extramarital affair since the beginning of their ministry. 70% said that the only time they spend studying the Word is when they're preparing their sermons. Now, when I first shared these statistics with our team, I'm not kidding you, we cried and we prayed. I said, Lord, if there's a way that we can serve leaders in churches so that they are in fact the ones that are the ones most reflecting the character of Christ, to then provide that influence to create a church that is reflecting the character of Christ, so that that church can reflect the character of Christ in the community, loving others and loving God. Father, that's what we want to do. So this whole time together is organized around a leader, your soul, your church, what's going on there. And it's those two combined to, have the kind of impact and influence we're all wanting to have in our communities. And my prayer during this time is that we would help, as the church grows larger, that we won't grow institutions that are destroying the very people that are leading them. That's where my heart breaks. And so some of the work that we're doing, because you need to know it is possible to have your soul grow and to have your soul be healthy and have a growing church. It is possible, but it's not going to happen by default. It's going to happen. It's going to happen with intentionality, with some planning, because as these churches get larger, they get more complex. And now think about the senior pastor role. You know, not only do they need to preach, which takes maybe 20 hours a week of study and prep and all that, they're now a resource allocator. Now they're building teams. Now they're hiring and firing, and now they're building buildings and land development. And I mean, they're doing so many more roles that the senior pastor of a local church never did in the history of the church. Again, that was all hierarchy that was above the church. Well, now a lot of that's inside local churches. So we need to help. We need to help each other build kinds of places that are flourishing for the leaders that work in these places. And it can be done. It can be done.